Today what I'm going to get into is a completely different set of thoughts that are related to what is called Austrian business cycle theory. It's called Austrian because the first major thinkers in this tradition were Karl Menger and some of his students who were based out of Vienna in Austria. Shortly thereafter, the people who paid attention to his writings and his work moved all over the world. Today, the biggest centers of Austrian economic thought are probably at NYU and George Mason University, and also at Auburn University. So most Austrian stuff today is in the US. The term Austrian merely identifies sort of a school of thought, a way of thinking about these issues. The best person to learn Austrian economics from, especially when it comes to Austrian macroeconomics, is Steve Horwitz. He's not teaching a course on Austrian macro, but he wrote the book on it. Actually, he's written a couple of books on it. So if you get interested in these ideas and want to learn a little bit more about them, I've given you readings from Roger Garrison and Pete Becky. Pete and Steve are like BFFs. But if you really get interested in these ideas, Horwitz is your man. I'm going to do my best to present these ideas today to you, however. Okay. The Austrian point of view starts with the idea that we don't just have capital and then output. It's not just homogeneous capital inputs and then homogeneous consumable outputs. Instead, the Austrian theory says both of these are heterogeneous. And not homogeneous. There's lots of different kinds of capital, and there's lots of different kinds of output. So you can have a mine with raw ore in it, and that would be a relatively low level of input. It has to go through various stages of production before we eventually get to goods and services that are ultimately consumable. And as it goes through these various stages, the inputs into the production process are changed. And this does not happen immediately. This takes time. You could take, maybe as an example, you can have an apple, which you could immediately consume. Or you could take that same apple and make apple cider from it. So we go from just taking the raw apple and consuming it, then we squeeze it and turn it into cider. Now, when we turn it into cider, that takes time. You have to build a cider press. You have to postpone your consumption of the apple in some way for a time until you can consume it. But when you do consume it, you like it better than just eating the apple. The consumption, sort of the height of this bar, is sort of representing how much you enjoy it. Are you with me? Okay. You enjoy it so much that you might actually be willing to postpone consuming the apple, but also you might be interested in growing more apples so that you can consume them through cider. That is, the value to the consumer derives from the final product down to the inputs into production, as compared to thinking about value as being the sum of the inputs into production, your labor, the amount of capital that had to be bought, Instead of trying to treat the value of the thing that you consume as coming out of the things that went into making it, those things that you use to make what you consume only have value because you someday want to consume them. The value is flowing from our individual subjective valuation down, okay, to those things that are involved in production of it. Now, you can take an apple and make apple cider from it. You have to wait. But if you wait longer, that cider takes on another quality. Right? Some of the sugars in the cider may convert into alcohol. And now you really like that cider. Right? You really, really want that cider now. So it's like increased in its value again. Again, you had to wait. Again, there was a postponement. There's a time element involved in getting to this higher level of preference, to this level of consumption. We talked about this, and I often talk about this in intro micro, by thinking about, a production possibility frontier between coconuts and fishes. And if you've got Robinson Crusoe on the island alone, he maybe can collect a certain number of fishes and a certain number of coconuts in a given day. But if he wants to have more fishes, he might reduce his consumption of fishes and coconuts today, tighten his belt a little bit, and instead of spending as much time fishing and coconutsing, he might spend time making a net. So for the short run, he has a lower level of overall consumption because he's postponing consumption so that later on, once he has the net, he's able to reach a higher level of overall production. And we call this the roundabout way of production. The term roundaboutness comes from a fellow named Eugen von Bellwerk, who was one of Karl Menger's students. So we've got Menger, and you've got Bellwerk. There's a guy named Wieser, and then there's a guy named Mises and Hayek, right? And then these guys, then there's a guy named Kerzner who's still at NYU. There's a guy named Lockman who was in South Africa. And then out of sort of this school, we get Karen Vaughan and Don Lavoie, who helped to build the program at George Mason, from whom we get Horowitz and Becky and others. Garrison, I actually don't know where Garrison comes through in all this. There must have been something happening in Auburn for a little while. That's all not that terribly important. Just gives you a little bit of the concept of the heritage going on here. It helps to remember that Hayek was one of the main critics of Keynes. So in the overall movement in the 1930s about what should the government's role be in responding to the recession, Hayek was a big-time critic of the Keynesian approach. And the Austrian perspective is also critical of the Keynesian approach. Friedman was also critical of the Keynesian approach, but for different reasons. He was working within the Keynesian model. The Austrians are saying there's actually problems with the Keynesian model and problems with the monetarist model. The first being that, right, there's this homogeneity versus heterogeneity problem. There's different stages of production of capital. So if we go back to the Solow model and try to say, okay, we want to increase output, so we should buy more capital, the question is, what kind of capital? You can't just buy capital. You have to buy different kinds of capital. It's not just straightforward. there's different kinds of capital. Okay. That is to say that the structure of capital that we have matters. Coming back to the solo model. One way to think about this is to say, okay, if we have a certain level of consumption, we've gotten used to and are comfortable with a certain level of consumption. Here's year one, here's year two. If we're comfortable with that level of consumption, then we might not change our level of consumption, and we might not change our level of savings. But suppose we say to ourselves collectively, suppose a taste, a preference for a higher level of consumption becomes valuable to us. Well then, just like Crusoe, who for a short season decided to reduce consumption, in the same way, we can say, you know what? We want to have more consumption in the long run, and we're willing to give up some consumption now to get it. Well then, what would happen is that we would reduce our consumption for a couple of years, and then, as a result, be able to achieve higher levels of consumption in the future. We do see that in the solo model, right? If you have a given steady state level of capital, how do you move to a higher steady state? Well, you have to increase your savings rate, and that will boost your total level of output in the long run. But what's important about this, right, is that in the meantime, this amount of consumption that you had been engaging in, you have to give up that level of consumption, this much of the consumption, and save it instead. So if we were to draw a graph of our consumption path, right, it would do just that. We would have a certain level of consumption, then we would dip, and then it would come back up, and then reach a new steady state. So this perspective of the Austrian model is consistent with the solo model. How do we know, by observing the market, that people are willing to postpone consumption today in order to have more consumption tomorrow? What would we look at? What is a good measure of your time horizon? Gumballs now or ice cream later, right? The real interest rate should be indicating to us what it is that people want in terms of consumption now versus consumption later. So then, the time element, as coordinated through the interest rate, which is in the Keynesian model, is really important. But in the Keynesian model, if you consume less, that brings GDP down. And if you consume less and that brings GDP down, that will cause investors to invest less because they expect less consumption also in the future. So consumption and investment end up moving in the same direction most of the time in the Keynesian model. The Austrian model is saying that people will be willing to consume less now so that they can consume more later. It tries to bring back closer into connection the relationship between savings and investment. Where Keynes would say that this connection is somewhat broken. As a matter of fact, Keynes, in his own words, says, "Some fallaciously suppose that there is a nexus which unites decisions to abstain from present consumption with decisions to provide for future consumption." No. That's what Keynes says. He says, no, that connection doesn't exist. Question?
So Keynes believed that people just shoved their money under their mattress.
That's what he was observing actually happening at the time. Right? Due to the Depression, people actually were just shoveling their money under their mattress. And he treated that as savings. But so there was a disconnect between savings and investment. Notice one thing about this model, though, and it's consistent with this, right? We get a higher level of output by postponing consumption without there necessarily having to be a change in technology. It's not necessarily, oh, you've just got more capital, which is as far as the solar model goes. The way that the Austrian model would show this is actually what we've done is by adding in another stage of production, by increasing the roundaboutness involved in production, we've actually made it possible to have more. It's saying that somewhere there was an entrepreneur who did discover a technology or a different way of doing things that increases the roundaboutness, maybe that is the technology here, that then allows for greater amounts of consumption in the future. There may be an opportunity to do some research that connects the A term in the ManQ technological change model with this roundaboutness in the Austrian model. They just tend to talk way past one another on these issues, so it's really hard to do that. Again, the trick here is disaggregating that K term, saying there are different kinds of capital. Sometimes what happens is a different raw material is brought into production. So for example, when we were running out of whales to produce lamp oil, we discovered that kerosene works too. So bringing some other different raw material into the production process can increase our ability to consume in the long run. Another way of illustrating this that sort of incorporates these bar chart approach. The bar chart is sometimes called the Hayekian triangle, just for reference. The way this is sometimes drawn is to say that if there are different stages of production associated with consumption, we might have only a few stages of production, 1 and 2. But then, by being willing to consume less, we're able to increase the number of stages of production. So then we build a third stage of production. Because we're consuming less, we're able to develop a third stage of production. That additional stage of production makes us have the potential for more production in the future. And then we add a fourth stage of production, a fifth stage of production, a sixth stage of production, and eventually we're able to get to having more consumption in the long run. This again is that idea of roundaboutness. These pictures are attempts to provide an analogy of what's going on. One thing that comes up is this economic growth becomes endogenous to the individuals who are making ultimate decisions as compared to being exogenous. That is to say, instead of the way that Matthew talked about enforcing or imposing a different savings rate in order to achieve a golden rule steady state level of capital, this model says individuals, in revealing of their time preferences by being willing to postpone consumption and increase investment, are endogenously demonstrating their own personal preferences for economic growth. So if you saved more today, you would be able to help build economic growth in the future, and you'd also be able to consume more in the future. A penny saved is a penny earned, right? Well, what is the thing that determines your individual preference of consumption relative to saving today and over time? Suppose we, drew a production possibility frontier between consumption and investment. You're saving some of your money, but you're consuming an awful lot more. Actually, I guess I should put that over here. Well, this slope here, the slope wherever you find yourself on this trade-off between consumption and investment, is really revealing your interest rate, your personal discount rate. If for some reason, some sort of policy individual were able to impose a savings rate, then there would end up being discoordination between individual preferences and the policy outcome. That matters because it matters where the investment is going. The interest rate is the time price of money. Or really, it's the time price of when you want to consume things. Coordination through the interest rate among the various different stages of production comes to an equilibrium through individual preferences and through entrepreneurs investing and seeking out profit opportunities by developing different kinds of economic activities at different stages of production. Without having an interest rate that is truly revealing the preferences of individuals and the reading of those preferences by entrepreneurs, we can't know whether we've achieved what it is that people actually want. Notice I didn't say we haven't achieved what people want. We can't know whether we've achieved what people actually want. One way of thinking about this is to think about the quantity theory of money from Milton Friedman. And it's helpful to remember that Friedman actually wrote this as MV equals P times Q. The quantity of what? You've got money flow, velocity of money, the prices of things, the quantity of things, but Y, remember, includes C, I, G, and then X. So we can take consumption and we can hold government and trade constant for a minute and say, okay, well, this has to be equal to P times quantity of consumption plus quantity of investment. But again, investment, purchasing of capital, isn't always just purchasing of the same capital. It's not homogeneous. So you have to say, well, this is actually equal to P of QC plus quantity of stage 1 capital, quantity of stage 2 capital, quantity of stage 3 capital, and so on. Well, what's interesting about this is that a change in the interest rate suppose the interest rate falls. What does that mean? It means that people are demonstrating that they are more willing to postpone consumption till some date farther in the future. That's what a fall in the interest rate says. If the interest rate falls, then they're saying, I want to see I'll make sure I get this right for you guys. I want to see more consumption in the long run, but I'm willing to give up some of it today. So if Q1 represents consuming of things today, then I'm willing to give up some consumption of Q1. And I'm willing to give up some consumption of Q2, and I want there to be a little bit less of Q3, but what I'd like to see is more production of farther along stages of capital so that in the long run I'm able to consume more. So then different kinds of capital are affected differently, all by the same interest rate. So the interest rate doesn't simply say buy more capital or buy less capital. It says buy more of certain kinds of capital and buy less of other certain kinds of capital. Increase the roundaboutness so that in the long run we do end up with more consumption, but we're willing to deal with less in the short run in order to get there. If we treat all capital as homogeneous, then we're denying that the interest rate is a useful signal that indicates which different kinds of capital ought to be purchased. So the final step kind of in this Austrian point of view is to say, okay, when people make a decision between consumption and investment to reduce their consumption and increase investment, that is related to what is happening in the market for loanable funds, where we're used to talking about there being a supply curve and a demand curve for loanable funds. By people saying, we're willing to postpone some consumption, that is effectively increasing the supply of loanable funds. That results in a decrease in the interest rate and an increase in both savings and investments. This is related to this model of the stages of production. Here we had a high slope sort of stage of production, or a high level of consumption, but we're willing to give that up in order to, in the short run, have a longer stage of production, which increases output, which in the long run will increase the number of stages of production such that consumption is increased. Now, what could go wrong? We could be in an equilibrium we could be in an equilibrium such that there is a demand and a savings level for loanable funds, and that it is related to what seems to be a particular structure of production. So when we think about the arrangement of the different stages of production, we'll call it the structure of production. But then an intervention could come along. What kind of an intervention? Well, how about easy credit? What's related to easy credit? How do we get easy credit or loose money? The Fed increases the quantity supply of money. If the Fed increases the quantity supply of money, we end up getting a lower nominal interest rate. That lower nominal interest rate should be related to an increase in savings. However, we got that lower interest rate without consumers saving more. We did this without consumers doing anything. And instead, what we have here is what looks like a lower nominal interest rate that is related to a higher level of consumption. So then, we have two different signals being sent to the market for production. One signal says, because the interest rate is low, because there's more savings going on, one signal says, hey entrepreneurs, people are willing to postpone consumption today to have more consumption later. Invest in deeper and deeper stages of production. Increase the complexity of the structure of production. While at the same time, there's another signal that is telling entrepreneurs, hey, consumers want more consumable goods now. Produce more consumable goods now. And there results a discoordination. Such that entrepreneurs don't really know, don't have as good of a signal about what it is that consumers really are saying that they want in the long run. And this is made worse, where the worst case scenario for this develops when investors read this signal and invest in more and more complex structures of production. That could involve investing in a really big factory. Or it could involve saying, hey, you know what, I could build a more complex supply chain with part of my production going on over here and part of my production going on over there. This part of my production needs water. This part of my production needs heat. How about if I build a railroad between the two? And you invest all of these resources into making slightly more complex your structure of production in order to capture what you think are going to be efficiencies. You spend all the money on this, and then it turns out that you were wrong. That this is something closer to the true signal that consumers were sending. And as a result, you've invested lots and lots of resources in this alternative way of production. You have, like Crusoe, reduced your consumption and effectively harmed your ability to produce other forms of capital because you've got all of these real resources tied up in what you invented or what you produced, such that when you realize it's not going to work, you don't even have the capital that you used to have available to you to produce where you used to be able to get to on your old production possibility frontier. You've been doubly frustrated. So Hayek claimed that this is what happened in the Great Depression. that leading up to the Great Depression, there was a boom of investment that was fueled by a nominal interest rate that was artificially held low by loose money at the Federal Reserve. That sent a bad signal to entrepreneurs about what to make. They made a lot of stuff that resulted in large inventories. That then, once the signal fed through this mechanism and people realized that this was garbage, that this was true, then people didn't have, all those inventories were tied up and people couldn't access them, and their actual level of ability to produce was reduced. We wound up, below our production possibility frontier. That means that there's unemployment as a result. Now, this theory is hard to empiricize. It's hard to get, first of all, it's not at all written in a way that you can turn into a regression in a straightforward way. There are people who do this kind of thing. But it's a little bit more sophisticated, because how can you actually truly identify all the various different stages of production? How can you know what the various different stages of production should or are? They're constantly changing. So it's very hard to create like some sort of an empirical model of this, because you'd have to do this not just for one industry, but for every single industry. And there's millions. So it's hard to do. Now, the bigger picture model of what's happening here is helpful in thinking about bubbles, like the housing bubble. So I'm going to post a link, because I'm about out of time. I'm going to post a link to a short video recorded by Professor Harwitz that relates this Austrian model to the 2008-2009 housing crisis. And that should bring it home. Okay. There's more to this, obviously, but this is as far as I'm going to take it. I wanted you mostly to be exposed to it as an alternative way of thinking about things. For the rest of the semester, I'm not doing chapters 6 and 13. They're out. That's all that was left in the syllabus, I think. Well, chapter 18. I'm going to do a little bit of chapter 18 next week and the week after. And I'll post stuff about that. But I'm not doing chapter 6 and 13. Now, those are related to international trade. If you're really interested in that, please read those chapters and absorb some of the material there. If you're really interested in international trade, take Cecil's class on international economics. And you'll get much, much deeper into all of that then. But I decided to push that off for now. That'll give you more time to read your books, write your book reviews, and to do the problem set that's going to come out. Now, problem set, it's late coming out, so I want you to have 2 full weeks to do a problem set and then have time to go over it and study for the final. So my guess is that there probably will be a problem set with 15 questions on it, worth 150 points. That'll cover the rest of the material for the course. That then you can do that problem set and get feedback on it before the exam. The extra 50 points that are missing there, I'll just give them to you. So that should round out the numbers.